The lease was probably like this thick.
Oh,
and
goodness.
it was, outrageous for what it was. And the big thing is whenever you're doing any commercial lease, you have to look at the CAM and you have to look at the increases that happen in it, because you have your base rent and that price could be fine and that could be fair. But with whatever the increases are, and particularly how the CAM is structured, it can make or break you.
Can you explain to our audience what you mean by CAM and what that represents?
Sure. So CAM is basically common area charges. So it could be something as simple as just the property taxes, or it could be as elaborate as snow removal, insurance, the grass, the painting of the building, repairing the outside of the building, the sidewalks, the parking lots, right? So if they go to repave the parking lots, for an example, you could be on the hook for part of that cost, depending how big your store is in that building or strip center. So basically, the person who bought the building despised the owner that I bought it from. During the housing crash, he tried to basically force a renegotiation of the lease. So what him and his business partner decided to do was, we've asked her to lower the rent. The landlord didn't want to do it. So they said, all right, we're going to go into bankruptcy and we're not going to pay them. And then they'll be forced to renegotiate the rent. Well, it didn't work out for them. They got an eviction notice on the door and basically totally destroyed the relationship that he had with this new landlord. And from that point on, it was just a back and forth of how can I make your life harder kind of situation. And again, when your lease is this thick, the landlord has the power to basically make your life hell in a way. So, for example, he got an $8,000 snow bill because the landlord didn't care. She wasn't paying for it. She found the most expensive person to remove the snow and things like that. So eventually, after all of the garbage and back and forth was sorted between them, one thing that came out was he did get a slight break in the rent. It was capped at a price. And basically, with me taking over the lease, now all of a sudden, what I thought I was paying in rent increased by about $2,500 a month, which led to me going back to him, and we knocked a big chunk off of that sales price because now the cash flow isn't what we both thought it was. Now it's something totally different.
So was that not disclosed in the numbers that you and him saw?
So when we were going over the numbers, basically, he was paying, let's say, it was $10,000 a month, all in. And according to the actual lease, it should have been like $12,000 and change on it. So when I had my first conversation with the landlord, this was basically the first thing that she brought up with me was, the rent is actually this because he has this break that I gave him, but he has to pay back the rent that he didn't pay during his time there. So basically she clawed back what he should have been paying from him. And unfortunately for him, that came from the sale of the business.
I think this is a great lesson for those that are either in the industry or maybe even looking to get in the industry or maybe even other businesses, to be honest, is to understand how powerful a lease is and how powerful it is to have, experts, attorneys, whatever you want to call them, reviewing these things especially when they're this thick. But I've seen people get caught off guard by 20-page leases. And just making sure you understand the rent is this, but this is not the same as renting an apartment. This isn't $700 a month and you get a 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment. That's not how this works. There's all kinds of things that are added on. And in your case, a lot of them are, in a lot of leases, they're capped and you can negotiate caps and things like that. In your case, it sounds like there really was no ceiling. So they could pretty much do whatever they wanted.
Exactly. So that CAM section is basically where they can say, hey, we're going to spend, $20 grand on a parking lot. And now you have to pay us your portion this year. Is basically how the lease was structured. Like you said, there has to be some physical dollar limit. And more importantly, that CAM should only be able to increase so much each year, just like whatever the increases are in the rent. So in that bad lease, the rent itself increased 3% every year. Now, if you sign a lease in the height of a housing and real estate market, and now you're adding 3%, 3%, 3%, now all of a sudden it's a crazy, crazy number.
I want to just push pause real quick, if I could, Charles, and just point out to people, first of all, we appreciate you being so transparent because, we can all learn from our successes, but we can learn usually more from each other's, failures. And failure is a lot of times a temporary thing. You've obviously learned your lessons from these things, but it's no secret in the industry, but I just want to call note to it right now. One of the few things in this industry that is almost impossible to overcome is a bad lease. Because the problem with a bad lease is it gets badder. I'm pretty sure that's
not a word.
I know. I did that on purpose. I was going to say it gets badder and badder and badder. The one thing about a bad lease is it gets worse. I actually did that intentionally. But anyway, and the reason for it is you mentioned it a minute ago, it compounds, right? One thing about a lease is if it's bad right now, you're not going to get 3% off next year. That's not how this works, but you probably will have an increase of 1, 2, 3% next year and the year after and the year after. And in a lot of cases, the property owner, while they should care about your business and your health because that affects their tenant, they usually don't care. If they figure if you go belly up, you go bankrupt, you move out, somebody else will come in and take over. They'll make them pay the same rent. When they don't care if you pay it or Carla pays it or I pay it, it doesn't matter to them. They're determined that somebody's going to pay them that rent. And a lot of times that's how, laundromats have the negative connotation associated with it that we do, is because it's not common for people to react to adversity like you're experiencing in a bad lease the way you did. And I suspect that. I don't know if you did at the time, but you probably do now. It's not common to say, well, I'm going to take responsibility and accountability for this. And I'm going to go beat the streets and find new revenue streams and try to increase my prices, increase my value proposition. Instead, a lot of times what happens is people just throw up their hands and give up. And they just say, well, I'm not paying any attention to that business because I'm not making any money anyways. What do I care if it goes out of business?
And then you basically have a self-fulfilling prophecy of,
absolutely.
Well, now you're not involved. Now it's getting worse and worse. And then on top of that, your lease is getting worse and worse. And now you have a total disaster.
And that's how people understandably give up. Is they don't, I don't know if they don't realize that there's another option or, everybody's different, I suppose. But my point is I appreciate you bringing that to people's attention because location, parking, and a bad lease, meaning bad location, bad parking, and a bad lease are 3 of the few things in this industry that I never say never, are very, very difficult to overcome. Yeah, if you can find leverage on your commercial property owner, you can renegotiate a bad lease. But when you're a fixed business like a laundromat, you can't exactly move across the street very easily. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is we just throw our hands up and give up. The interesting thing is, and the thing I want to hear about is I've been saying that for years. The one thing that's very difficult to do is move a laundromat. And I know that's what you did. So I want to hear about this and what was your thought process as you go through this? Because this is, this is very rare. And I think that our audience is probably sitting forward in their chairs a little bit right now, pretty interested to hear this story because I suspect there's other people out there. I know there's other people out there that are in bad leases that are trying to figure it out. And one thing we always say is, it's really difficult to move a laundromat or a lot of times impossible. So walk us through that process.
Yeah. So as time goes on, we're still growing, and the store is still, netting more, which is great. But again, our problems are still the lease. So I realized, this is like I have a few more years left here. I want to renew. I want to have a better lease. I don't know if that's going to happen. So a distributor that I knew, he brought us a deal that was actually like 2 miles away. And it was a store that was another zombie mat. It was basically abandoned. The landlord tried to run it. He ran it into the ground. Then the landlord tried to sell it. Couldn't get anything for it. So basically it was, we're giving you this store. You have to rent it, but everything needs to be gutted. So me and my father basically went into that together. My father's an architect. So we redesigned that store, got that open, and that was our second store. Again, that was great because I learned from my first bad lease, and we got a decent lease on this second store. So we have now that second store up and running, and that second store is doing great. And now fast forward to where our main store is, the lease basically ends in about 2 years. So I'm looking at what either A, I stay, or I close shop and maybe just do everything, my pickup and delivery stuff, out of our Neptune store, which is our second store. Or do I move somewhere else right in my same area? So I'm looking, and say, all right, I got a good attorney from actually that works with Eastern Funding. I asked Eastern Funding, can you recommend me a good attorney that does leases on laundromats? So I gave him my lease. He looked over it, and surprise, it was really bad. But
and you looked at that attorney and said you had to go to law school to figure that
out. So basically, we looked at it like, all right, we can't really break it, so we're not breaking it. And then how do we exit in a peaceful way, and how can we exit? What can we take out of the store without having a problem legally later on? I had Brian Brill write me a nice letter of basically he was going to give me funding to remodel this store in Ocean Township. So if I was going to stay there, I needed to put in new washers. I needed to do a new card system, and I needed to do some improvements to the store itself. So I had Brian write this nice letter. I explained to the landlord that I want to stay here a very long time. I have funding lined up, but in order for this funding, I need to have a new lease. I would like to do another new 10-year lease with a 10-year option. And I want to give you good income for, going forward, but I need the rent to be a fair market rent. Now, at this point, I was paying $14,000 a month, which is basically double what the market rent was. So basically, the answer was no. If you want more time, I'll gladly give you another 10 years, but the lease stays what it is. I showed comps of, hey, this is what these are renting for, but nothing
They had you
phased them.
stuck, and they wanted to keep it that way at least 2 more years.
Yep. And at that point, I went, okay, so I'm not staying here. Now I have in my head, I have to get out. I have a hard deadline. So I'm looking around, and there was a building maybe like 200 yards down from where I was, and it was for sale. Okay, great. I can buy this building.
You're speaking my language, Charles. You're speaking my language.
I'll put a store here. This is fantastic. And that building that I wanted to buy, someone else bought it. So I'm like, oh, great. So now I'm looking at this building because this person is remodeling the whole outside of the building. They're doing all this work to it. And they're basically doing a better job at it than what I would do myself. So they had a sign, space for rent, called them. We were able to get a really good lease. And the price per square foot was fair and good, but more importantly, that CAM structure was controlled. It had a cap of what percentage rate that it could grow each year, and it had a dollar amount cap on it as well. So that way, if there was some crazy thing happening, I'm not being screwed with it, which was crucial on it. And I got an option to buy the building and stuff like that. So it worked out very good as far as that lease goes.
Did you achieve your goal of roughly cutting your rent in half?
Oh yeah, it was less than half. Now the one thing that was slightly worse is I basically gave up about 400, 500 square feet of space.